I would say make s yeah, I think it's on. Make sure you feel firmly planted and balanced. So let's try rocking right, and what you'll notice if you start out where you think the middle of that rocking right and left, say right, you can feel it starts to grab you. So that's one way. The other way, and right in between those places where gravity takes hold is kind of the middle. The same thing forward and back. Find midpoint. It's not it's not necessarily the case that, you know, that's absolutely the geometrical midpoint, but it's the midpoint with respect to your body, which is the important thing. So find that and then um, let your lower body settle, make sure that it really feels like your knees are resting firmly on is that they're resting on, or if you're sitting in a chair, your feet are resting firmly on the floor, right? Um, and your your butt, in particular, your sit bones are firmly planted on what they're sitting on, so that the weight between the weight distribution between your feet and sitting in a chair or your knees if you're sitting on a mat, even and soft. And then imagine that down here underneath your navel, um, in the middle of your body, there's this place at the bottom of your breathing apparatus. In Japanese, they call your hara, right? Imagine that there's a planet in your hara and that it's holding up your sternum, right? So there's a lift there, and related to that, you can make sure that your shoulders are sort of out and in line with your ears. So the energy in your shoulders is there's a line from your ears right out your shoulders, and then your arms come around in a circle with your left palm on top of your right palm and your thumb tips touching in another circle. And that can just float with your the little fingers of both hands kind of pressed gently up against your lower abdomen. Um, if you're sitting in a chair, and sometimes if you're sitting in seiza, that can be th- that mudra can be resting in your lap, which is fine. There's another mudra if you might want to try sometime sitting in seiza, where you put your um, right thumb inside your right hand and wrap your inside your left thumb and your right thumb inside your left hand. Wrap your left hand around it, and then bring your right hand around the front of your left hand like this. So both your thumbs are tucked in and your hands are clasped around each other. That tends to ride a little higher, and sometimes that can be helpful when you're sitting seiza. But anyway, that's more of a rinzai um, and martial arts mudra. But anyway, so with that chest in your chest support and with your shoulders like that, it means your chest is opened up and makes lots of room for your breath. And on top of that, your head should float up towards the ceiling as though it was supported by some anti-gravity device or maybe just a string attached to this spot right here. And gently pulling your head up. Hmm. So, with respect to the breath, um, the key to the breath in zazen is again the hara, this place down below your navel. So you can tighten the muscle. This is essentially yogic breathing. You can sort of slightly tighten the muscles in your pelvic floor and in your lower stomach muscles. And with that sort of that lock in place, just breathe all the way out. And then when the breath is all the way out, and it can take a while to breathe all the way out, just wait until your diaphragm says, hey, it's time. And then allow the breath, release the tension and allow the breath to just flood up. And it feels like it's flooding up out of your hara and filling your body. And if you like, you can even imagine it that as you breathe out, the breath is falling down the front of the body. Into the hara. And then when you breathe in, let it go, and the breath comes up and floods up your back, up your neck, and lands about here. That's a kind of exaggerated version of it, but and it's good to do it in a slightly exaggerated way, although maybe not as noisy as I just did. And maybe 3 to 5 times at the beginning of a session of zazen, and then kind of let it go, relax it a bit, and just do the same thing, but with only a really slight emphasis on the out breath and at your own rate and depth, and don't force it to be long or short. Great. So we're going to sit for a bit, and then we're going to do some walking meditation. So. So as you sit, turn your awareness towards your awareness. So it's worth asking, what is it that I'm aware of? Hmm. There's a whole river of information that we're swimming in all the time. Our proprioceptive sense, our sense of the kind of tightness and looseness and comfort and discomfort of our muscles and joints. Awareness of the posture more generally. And then the light coming through our eyes, resting on our retina. The sounds both of our own internal apparatus. I don't know about you, but after years of playing in rock bands for a living, I have a sort of whistling in my ears all the time. But also out there, there's what sounds like trance music. Yeah. And more subtly, the sense of smell, the sense of the surface of our skin. Even maybe a little bit of taste every now and again. Each of those senses has a realm, and our perception moves between those realms smoothly, right? And also the functioning of the mind, of our cognition, has a realm, and our attention turns towards that as well. And so the question is, there's a sort of schema that classifies all of those sensations and all that mental activity as having a valence that's pleasant or unpleasant, and a kind of degree of excitation that runs from not very excited up to really excited if there's something, really exciting going on, right? Mm. Everything else that we overlay on top of that is it's kind of for lack of a better metaphor, it's kind of the meat and potatoes of Zazen. Let's say it's the, you know, deep fried tofu and potatoes of Zazen. It's the stuff that we practice with. And the question is, when a sensation arises into perception, or a thought rises up and takes our attention, when we notice that a thought has arisen and taken our attention, what's our reaction? Do we like it or dislike it? Do we take it in with a kind of curious and welcoming attitude, even if it's not particularly pleasant, right? Like, it's as though you're welcoming a guest that you're not really sure you wanted to invite, but here they are anyway, and so why not welcome them, right? So to be really aware of the valence with which each of those perceptions or thought events lands, and how you take it in. That's the essential activity of zazen. So if you sit in a Zen monastery and a period of zazen ends and it has two bells like that, it means that it's time for walking meditation. So it's time for walking meditation. So why doesn't everyone stand up? And I wonder how to do this. It's probably good. Yeah, so here's what we're going to do. So once you, let's just do a little standing meditation. So stand with your feet about that apart. And so right under your hips, right? Knees slightly bent. With your pelvis slightly tucked so that if you breathe, if you hold your upper body the way it was in zazen, there's this natural phenomenon that happens where your stomach muscles kind of flatten out and your navel kind of turns up a little bit. So, this is a yoga standing posture, but if you're interested, the canonical way of holding your hands in this particular form of walking meditation is you close your left thumb inside your left palm, put your right palm in front of it, and then put your right thumb on top, and you hold it right around your sternum, basically. Right? Yeah. Awesome. Yeah. So everyone turn to their left. And we're going to walk around in a circle a bit. So, and the way we walk is very slow. So wait for your next out breath. And on the next out breath, plant your left foot slightly in front of your right. And then as you're sort of moving forward on the in breath, you start really transferring your weight completely to your left foot and kind of slowly lifting up the back of your right foot. And then on the out breath, you plant your right foot in front. And then, repeat. And your eyes are downcast straight in front of you and not really looking at anything. So it's possible to think of this as just an extension of a period of zazen, but it has a very different flavor to it. It's much more directly dependent on awareness of the breath. And it involves playing subtle sort of games with your balance and posture as you move forward. So we're kind of walking around in a circle. Yeah, you're doing good. Really feel your feet planted on the floor. Feel the way they spread out and take hold and really settle themselves on the floor. And it can feel like your head is holding up the sky. All right, so walk pretty quickly back to your seat and sit down, and then we'll talk about it. So, does anybody have any comments, questions about either Zazen, Kinhin, which is the walking meditation we did, or anything about the observation of your mental and physical activity and what you were aware of? Anything about any of that before we move on? Yeah, go ahead.
I was curious. I wondered if I missed an instruction, but I feel like I was sort of syncing it with my breath, and that felt very fast compared to what we were all doing. I was curious if pace is of particular importance, or like.
Well, it's everybody should walk in time with their breath, and so what you do is you want to kind of breathe more or less naturally and walk along with it. So if you're breathing relatively fast, right, then you take shorter steps. To keep the speed everyone's moving about the same, because otherwise you kind of walk up on somebody and you're like breathing down their neck, right? So over time, my experience with sitting is that the breath naturally slows down and deepens a bit, and so you just kind of naturally walk slower. But mainly, it's a balance between you really want to breathe at your own rate and depth, and then adjust your walking speed by either taking long steps or short steps in order to stay sort of the same with everybody, right? Yeah, sure. Anyone else? Well, I thought I'd talk about a koan. In fact, I kind of thought what I would do is for a while do a koan a week and see if we can like climb a few footholds up the massive the volume I'm going to be taking these koans from is called the Blue Cliff Record, right? So it's an extremely famous collection of stories that mostly are derived from literature or from records of the teachings of masters from the Tang Dynasty, but they were collected into these big volumes with commentaries and poems and all the rest of that sort of thing in the Song Dynasty. And this one is really one of the most famous. So, and it was supposedly compiled while living in a hut on Blue Cliff somewhere. So we're going to climb Blue Cliff a bit, right? So anyway, so I've already talked about the first story in the Blue Cliff Record, so I'm not going to start there. So I figured I'd start with the second one. So the second one goes like this. Zhao Zhou, who was a extremely famous and probably one of the greatest Zen masters of all time, and certainly of the Tang Dynasty, was talking to his monks, and he says, the great way is ultimately without difficulty. It's easy, right? All you got to do is avoid picking and choosing. and then he says, but the minute you open your mouth and start using words or thinking in words, right, you find yourself thinking things like, this is clarity, this is picking and choosing, right? Um, and there's an implicit preference there. And he says, what I've discovered is I can't stay in clarity. So he says, the question is, do you preserve anything or not? And I guess the one thing to point out there before we move on is that the statement, the path is ultimately without difficulty, you'll just avoid picking and choosing, is from a document called the Xinxinming, which is Chinese for, I think it really just means the faith scripture, although often Xinxin, it's a compound in Chinese, which means trust mind, right? And so some people translate it as trust in mind, but that's not necessarily the case. It's just about it's essentially a scripture about faith, right? And which is kind of interesting because you usually think of meditation practice is founded on faith, but it really kind of is, right? So it says the Xinxin Ming was written by this guy named Zhangzhi Song Dynasty, who's credited as being the sort of third patriarch of the Zen school in China. Although the funny thing is, historically, he probably never even said the word Zen, or in Chinese it would be Cha'an, even once in his life. But he's still, credited as the third patriarch. He was actually from a school of monks. Who I think were called the East Mountain School, because they were in this sort of cluster of mountains in central China that was full of monasteries and all the rest of that sort of thing. And they were on the east one. So, and they had he and a bunch of other people in the Zen lineage were from that school. So, but in any case, he's credited with writing the Xinxin Ming. No one really knows if he ever wrote, that he wrote it, right? It could have been written by somebody else, but he's the guy that's credited with it. And so Zhao, I think probably at least 100, if not more, years later, is quoting this famous scripture and making a comment on it by saying, easy to say, right? So I'll repeat the whole thing again, right? He says, the way is easy, just avoid picking and choosing. And he says, but as soon as you start talking or thinking in words, you find yourself saying, look, this is picking and choosing, or this is clarity. And he said, I've discovered that I can't stay clear, right? So what can you preserve, or what do you preserve? And a monk comes forward and says, well, okay, so what do you preserve? And Zhao says, I don't know either. and then the monk won't give it up. He says, well, okay, so if you say you don't know, then how can you say that you don't you're not clear, right? And Zhao says, it's enough to ask the question. Now go sit down, basically. So I guess what I wanted to do was ask. So I've just told the whole story, right? When I tell you this story, does anything jump out at you? Do you have any ideas or thoughts, feelings, or anything else like that. And it'd be nice for everyone to speak up. And even if it's like, so I taught a class once. I've taught a bunch of classes about koans, but I taught a class once on koans, and I started out the first class with this koan that I think is one of the most sort of beautiful and significant in the entire literature. And it's a very short one, so I recited it. And I said, "So, anyone, what happens, in your mind when I recite this koan?" And this woman speaks up. She was an Irish journalist and really kind of, like funny and smart and clever and so on and so forth. But she said, "It makes me feel stupid, and I really don't like it." And she really kind of laid into me, actually. It was great. And in fact, as a result, I completely changed the curriculum of the koan study course. And instead of just reviewing koans, I had the entire class write koans for each other and then write comments on them and all that sort of thing. We published a book at the end, a short book. But anyway, so anything that comes up is great. So when you hear that story, what comes up for you? Anything? What? Go ahead. Yeah.
What do we mean by how can I approach defining the word preserve?
Yeah, it's a really great question. Life is just some mechanism that can be described as memory, and a process for applying that memory to the present moment in order to influence future outcomes. That's the most succinct definition of life you can come up with, right? And I think he's talking about that, right? I think he's talking about that actual activity of what can you remember or carry forward from your experience that will be beneficial and help. The underlying goal in all Buddhist practice is to relieve your own suffering and the suffering of those that you interact with, such that the realm of suffering is eased a bit, and maybe people behave more comfortably and skillfully with each other, and so on and so forth, right? So what can you preserve if you can't rest permanently in a state of utter clarity and lucidity, right? What can you preserve in order to help with that? I think that's what he's talking about, right? Yeah. And it's and let's be clear, he's also hinting at the answer, right? But we'll get to that. So what else? Anybody else? What else? Yeah.
I guess the idea of not picking and choosing, to me, suggests allowing things to simply be.
Yeah, I think that's right. There's a caveat there, though, right? Which is that it explicitly doesn't mean not doing anything, right? But yeah, I mean the principle is that when Sun Chan wrote the Xin Qin Ming, what he was saying was, perhaps slightly ironically, because it really is a complicated issue, right? Like if you can just not raise a preference, right, one way or the other, then the world naturally comes forth, and you meet it skillfully and in an uncomplicated, spacious manner, and you can meet it wholeheartedly, even if you don't like what you're meeting, right? And it's very easy to mistake that for, you know, like for, are you familiar with the whole dog in a burning house cartoon? It's a kind of a meme, right? Yeah, where the dog is sitting at the table with his cup of coffee and the house is burning down, and he goes, "This is fine." Right? It can be easy to mistake it for that, but it's not that, right? That's not the idea. It's more like, um, this is not fine, and I can meet it, and without um, being lost in its not fineness, um, respond skillfully and appropriately, right? Something like that. But yeah, good question, right? Um, what else? Yeah, go ahead.
It's kind of doesn't apply too much, but I was been writing, and I call them hood koans,
Mm-hmm.
and it's really fun to write these like little kind of like paradoxical statements,
Yeah.
but they're more based in like urban imagery and situations. So that kind of made me feel good that you had said that you had kind of led groups that write koans.
Yeah.
Because I almost thought it was like a little taboo, like I'm doing this secret thing, I'm writing koans. I thought they started writing koans a while ago, but I'm gonna like secretly just write these. But it's fun to like to do it.
Yeah, it is fun, and actually, I mean, the interesting thing is that, I mean, it's worth asking, like if the fundamental proposition on which Chan Buddhism was based, right? And when it finally became a thing, and actually it really only really became a thing in the Song Dynasty, right? But its fundamental proposition was that all the interesting stuff happens outside of the texts, right? And then what did they do after that? They wrote these massive tomes, right? This huge literature, right? Um, but if you look at it, what it intends is as it's intended as a demonstration of what it's like to actually carry forward the Dharma and this sort of, comfort and skill in the face of the human condition, and then ways of interacting that are helpful and and where people help each other stay awake and stuff like that, right? And so it's an answer to the question, okay, so what does that look like, right? And that question never stops being a question, right? And it has it's equally a question in the modern day, right? So there are people that try and write modern day koan collections, and they're kind of good, right? But and when we wrote a bunch of stuff in this class, we did this thing where we did it as a project where everybody wrote a koan, and then they handed it to the next person, and that person wrote a poem based on that, and then they handed it to the next person, and that person wrote a commentary on their koan, and then handed it off one more time, and somebody wrote a commentary on the verse, and so we had a whole book, right? And it's really, it was a worthwhile activity. So yeah, I'd say go for it, right? How many have you got?
10 or so.
Yeah, nice. I would say stop at 100. Nice. Anything else?
I don't really feel like I have any particular thoughts about the koan other than that I like, as always, the aspect of Zen that is kind of anti-language.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And yeah, it just always feels very true that when you can feel something out or break it down in a way that's non-linguistic or non-verbal, it's just way easier to deal with. And
Yeah, I think that's right. And you, I mean, you know, let's be clear. Language is a matchless gift, right? And at the same time, it's full of traps and snares, right? and and the framing the framing that we the conceptual framing that we do based on language of the world has to be wrong all the time, right? It just and so you have to be really kind of careful with it, right? Yeah, that's right. Yeah, I agree. And clearly that's what Jajo's saying, right? He's saying, the minute you start talking, you're you've kind of lost it. You're picking and choosing, basically, right? Yeah. Um, well, good. Thank you very much. So, Jajo raises this question, right? What is how can we grapple with exactly that dynamic that we were just talking about, where you see that being able to just take in the world in a straightforward manner and respond skillfully without without preconception in a wholehearted way is a gateway to a number of things. When Dogen in his Fukanza Zengi, in his introduction to Zazen, it says it another way. He says the moment the single a preference, like or dislike, arises, the mind is lost in confusion, and the way is as distant as heaven from earth, right? And then he goes on to describe how to work with that through sitting, right, in the Zazen. And he says that Zazen isn't really about learning anything in a conceptual way. It's a gateway to what he says is ease and joy, or sometimes it's translated as repose and bliss, right? So the claim that both Song-san and Dogen, and later Suzuki Roshi also, he says the same thing in the preface to Zen by Beginner's Mind. He says it's, there's this conception that it's hard to practice Zen, right? But nobody's really clear on why, right? He says it's not difficult in the end to sit Zazen. Everybody can find a posture that they're comfortable in, right? And, work it out so that their hip doesn't hurt, right? And everybody can start having these experiences of a sort of broader picture of what it means to be human that are usually identified as, enlightenment experiences, right? He says the problem is that anything that we care about, we get tangled up with in this way, where we have preferences and where we build conceptual frameworks and go, this thing in this conceptual framework is better than this thing, and so on and so forth, right? He says that's what makes it hard, right? And so how do we grapple with that, especially based on the recognition that because the world never stays put, it's impossible to stay clear, right? And so the monk asks him that, and he says, well, I don't know. And it's worth noting that this being the second koan in the Blue Cliff record, the first koan is about this encounter between Bodhidharma and the Emperor Wu, right? Where Bodhidharma holds up not knowing as a thing, right? And so in some ways, this koan is a subtle comment on that. So when the monk says, "Hey, what can you preserve?" And Jiaozhou goes, "I don't know." He's in some ways he's echoing Bodhidharma, right? And when the monk says, "Okay, so you don't know," so that means you have this don't know clarity. Why do you say you're not clear? And at that point, Jiaozhou says, "Go sit down," right? And he says it's enough to ask the question, right? So I would say that what this is all pointing to, right, is that what you can preserve is not a set of concepts, or although everybody does preserve a set of concepts, but the key thing to preserve, let's put it that way, it's not a set of concepts. It's not a particular state of mind. You shouldn't be clinging to a particular state of mind, because that sounds like picking and choosing, right? What you can preserve is a particular practice, right? And it's the practice that you learn by sitting, right? And it's a kind of embodied enactment of, in each moment, allowing the actual circumstances of the moment to trigger your awareness, right? And to allow them to land fully, right? Not throwing anything out, not adding anything in, and bring your internal state and your internal concepts along, but hold the whole situation such that it can all register, right? And let that combination suggest the next thing and the next thing and the next thing, right? And the experience of that, once you start doing it, is that there's this kind of, it's as though there's a kind of spacious container for your whole, for all that activity, for the activity of the outside world, for the activity of the inner world, to the extent that there's an outer and inner, right? Which there isn't, but and that the arising of that spacious container is re-triggered moment by moment, just by experience, right? And you can experience this when you sit, right? Like there's moments where there's a hint of that sort of spaciousness and unloaded awareness, right? And they're usually pretty quickly replaced with some sort of being enclosed and tangled up in a thought event or some story or something like that. And then that opens up again, and then it closes up again. And so to work with that cycle and those sort of two complementary modes of being is what we do when we sit, basically. And we note, and the thing to notice is what seems welcome and preferable and what doesn't, and to, as you were saying, just let them be themselves, right? Even again, if they're not particularly pleasant, like the famous three afflictions: sickness, old age, and death, right? Even in the case of sickness, old age, and death, the request is just let it be what it is, right? And it's amazing how freeing that is, right? And how it becomes possible to bring a kind of comfort and skill and this kind of unconditioned appreciation, even to that difficult terrain, right? So it does. So any questions about any of that? Well, great. So, Chow just said, the great way is easy. Just avoid picking and choosing. Then he said, the moment you start talking or thinking, you notice this is clarity. This is picking and choosing. I can't stay in clarity. So what do you preserve? Do you preserve anything or not? And monk said, well, what do you preserve? And if you can't stay in clarity, and Jaja said, I don't know, or I don't know either. And the monk said, since you say you don't know, how can you say you're not in clarity? And the Jaja says, it's enough to ask the question. Now sit down. In other words, study it, right? And bring up some curiosity and willingness to explore it in its entirety in the process, right? So let's do a little bit more of that, and then we'll call it a night. See if you can notice the difference between the feel of your mind when it's just present with what's happening right now, the contents of your sensorium, your sense of the body and breath, and so on. And then the other mode is one where you're engaged in rumination or sort of self-construction, telling the story of the self in the future, telling the story of the self in the past. Um, there's a distinctly different feel. It's as though there's a kind of gravity to the to conventional cognition that pulls in your awareness and kind of yanks it away from the broader picture of what it is to be this body, this mind sitting here, and that kind of lets go and opens up when awareness reoccurs. Right? Just to notice that, just to be close to it, and to let the trajectory of your own cycle of attention kind of register and show itself. Just to be with it. It's kind of like surfing or Dogen says, a fish swims in the water and inhabits its entire realm. The bird flies in the sky and inhabits its entire realm. It's where they belong. And the same is true for us. That's what we swim in. Just to get to know it. As intimately as you can, and with as much curiosity and gentleness as you can. And when you hear one bell, it means that Zazen is over. So I love this rim. It's like if when I'm sitting here and my gaze sort of widens out and settles, what it looks like is that you're all floating on some sort of clear, slightly spongy medium or something like that. It's kind of nice, actually. So how's your hip?
Much better.
Is that right? Nice. That's good. Excellent. Cool. Well, thank you so much for coming. Really, I really, really appreciate it. It was great.